Good, Good morning and welcome to the first MCERA webinar of 2022. Today we'll be hearing from 4 experts about the return to school pandemic style. 2 years into the pandemic, and we are continuing to see schooling disrupted, students learning from home, and others trepidatious about what learning looks like this year. As a disclaimer, I'm based in South Australia and I'm currently speaking to you from my dining room with my 2 primary aged kids down in the kitchen, hopefully diligently undertaking their schooling from home as the South Australian Department does a slow ease into return to schooling. Today, we will hear from experts from Macquarie, Monash, UTS and QUT as they speak to their respective areas of expertise about this transition period. Each speaker will present for about 5 minutes before passing to the next expert. At the end of everyone's presentations, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. This can be done through raising your hand and I will call on you to ask the questions. Otherwise, feel free to ask questions in the chat function, either via the group or via direct messaging to me. Our first speaker today will be Associate Professor Kathleen Tate. Kathleen will be speaking to the transition back to the class after remote learning, a particularly pertinent topic for students in Victoria and New South Wales, whose learning has been significantly impacted in the past couple of years. Dr. Don Carter is a senior lecturer in the UTS School of International Studies and Education, a former classroom English teacher and current English inspector at the New South Wales Educational Standards Authority. Don will discuss the importance of the classroom experience, especially for those transitioning into Year 12. We will then transition to Monash University's Dr. Pearl Subin, an educational psychologist who specialises in classroom practice and positive behaviour support. Pearl will discuss how the class of 2022 can equip themselves for the journey ahead through organisation and inspiration. Our final expert today is Dr. Rebecca English, member of the Australian Association for Research and Education, AARE, and a researcher at Queensland's University of Technology. Rebecca is a researcher and a mother whose work is concerned with parenting and education. Rebecca will discuss the push for home education for families concerned about COVID. At the conclusion of Rebecca's presentation, we will open up the discussion. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be available on MCERA social media channels in the coming days. Thanks, Kathleen.
Hi everyone, thank you Shannon for inviting me to speak on this topic today. I am on the land of the Darug Nation and I respect our past and present elders of that community. We're talking about transition to school, and transitions are really part of everyone's life. Some are predictable, while some are not predictable, as we've had in the last couple of years. And although the focus of this webinar is on transitions that occurred during the school years, it's worthwhile, I think, to think about transitions as some of a lifelong reality, because dramatic transitions, such as living with one's family and then getting to an age where you might move out to live alone or live with others, these sorts of transitions in life will happen as well. But these types of transitions are referred to as developmental or age-based, where we in some regards expect these transitions to occur in our lives or in our children's lives. However, there are other transitions which are not as predictable, such as the ones we're talking about today, the challenges ahead for students who have spent much of the past 2 years outside of the classroom. So when we're talking about managing transitions, we're really talking about managing change. And when we're talking about managing change, we're starting to address the issues of managing anxiety. So certain important elements are associated with increasing chances of any transition being successful. The point that we need to note here, I think, is that regardless of the transition that an individual is moving through, such as the transition to high school or the transition to that very important final year of school, Year 12, that certain activities will make that transition smoother, what we like to refer to as a seamless transition. And there are 3 important key elements, I think, that we need to address when we're looking to help a student to have a seamless transition. And that is systematic and comprehensive planning. That might involve assessment, it might involve individual planning if a student has a particular need. The second point is implementation of a plan of action, so a way of addressing any specific needs, helping with that systematic transition. And finally, coordination, cooperation, communication and collaboration with students and all of the relevant stakeholders that might be involved in helping that student to transition to whatever they're moving from. It may be it will be their family. It could be the primary teachers if the student is moving into secondary school. It could be the preschool teacher if the child's transitioning into primary school. It could be allied health professionals. There may be speech pathologists, occupational therapists, social workers, depending on the individual needs of that particular child when they're having to manage change, they're having to manage transition when they are learning to transition from A to B. So parents and teachers of students who spent much of the past 2 years of their schooling outside the classroom would do well to start to identify areas in which the students are strong, as well as where possible challenges might occur for that individual. And successful transitions will be relying on the identification of skills required in the school environment versus the home environment. So all of a sudden, we've got a situation of students who have been learning at home, and the day is 24 hours long at home. The school day is considerably shorter. So if a student wants to stop work on whatever task they're doing and go outside and kick a ball for a while, that's fine. They can do that. They can't do that in the school classroom. So there are time periods that students need to start to get back into being aware of, that they arrive at school and then they've got a period of time before they can have a break, before they can go to the toilet. The fact that they need to actually put their hand up and ask an adult to go to the toilet is something they've not had to deal with in the last couple of years. If they want to go out to their bag and grab something they've forgotten, they need to ask permission for that. So this is something that students haven't had to do in the last couple of years. And for some students, won't be a problem. For some individuals, that won't be a problem. It's addressing those students who, maybe don't have competence in those areas. So there's going to be, demands placed on students in classrooms that they haven't had to deal with in the last couple of years. And so how does that happen? Teachers need to maybe re-explain or explain, revise the classroom rules, and different teachers will have different rules. This can depend on the personality of the teacher, the way they like to structure their classroom. It can also depend on the curriculum area that's being taught. Some subjects can be conducted in, quite a noisy, boisterous, great exchange of information between students and teachers without any problem. Other curriculum areas need to have a much more quiet environment. So students need to, be reminded that different teachers require different classroom situations, and that different subject areas require different skills and different environments. So the sequence of events must be accomplished before students arrive at the secondary level by maximising these sorts of interventions, if you like. If transition planning is not conducted at all, if it's not considered, then we're going to find that there are possibly several problems are likely to arise. We're going to have, if we've got inadequate preparation of student in the sending environment, the home environment, if nothing's been done at home to prepare the child for, hey, you're going back to school in a week, a month, whatever, it's going to be a bit of a shock for some kids. Similarly, if there's inadequate preparation done by the receiving environment, that is the preschool, the primary school, the secondary school, middle school. Finally, I think it's really important to remember that a one-size-fits-all approach is not going to be successful, and that supporting transition back to school must be considered in the context of the individual, with a particular focus on related strengths, needs, and preferences. So for some students, we need to identify what their particular area of need is and think about a targeted intervention. For those identified as being potentially at risk or showing emerging school refusal as part of their transition back to school, then having some sort of plan in place can ward off the more serious and sometimes treatment resistant problem established school refusal. So I think help with a solution that's meaningful to the individual child is most important, and trying to transition students into understanding and feeling that they belong at school. This is their environment. This is where their friends are. This is where this is their spot, and it's another safe area, just as home is. So I'd like to finish there, and I'd like to hand over to my colleague at UTS, Dr. Don Carter.
Thank you very much, Kathleen, and thank you, Shannon, for the opportunity to speak this morning. I'm hoping that I'll be able to share my screen successfully here. Yeah, that looks better. And good morning, everyone. I'd like to talk about the importance of Year 12s going back to the classroom this year. I'm going to use Gert Biesta's 3 purposes of education as a basis for my discussion. And yesterday, interestingly, the New South Wales Premier announced a possible restructure of schools in New South Wales, which begs the question, and it's a debate that we need to have, we need to revisit what are the purposes of schools. Are they childminding centres? Have they become medical distribution locations, or are they sites of learning? So that's a central debate we need to have. And Biesta talks about that. He talks about qualification as one of the key purposes for education. And that becomes very important for Year 12 students as they move towards, in New South Wales at least they're moving towards demonstrating their skills in the higher school certificate. But qualification is a purpose that is embedded within the schooling system. Think about NAPLAN achievement, think about sporting achievements, debating achievements. They're all part of that qualification. So for Year 12s, moving towards the final year of schooling, their final assessments and their final exams is a very important time for them. So it's important that they're back in the classroom. Now, purpose 2 relates to socialisation. We know that schools are relational. They're based around building relationships between teachers and students, etc. But by Year 12, this purpose is particularly important because it involves those interactions with others at a scholarly level, an increasingly scholarly level. It's about deepening those knowledge and skills that will see them get through their final year of schooling, but go out into the workforce. But it's also about them developing their ideas and opinions. So the socialisation element or purpose is best handled through face-to-face on-site. So if I move into the 3rd purpose, this is what Biesta calls subjectification. But in fact, it's basically about developing self-identity. And developing self-identity comes through interacting with others. It comes with interacting and being challenged, others challenging your point of view. It comes with the teacher challenging the students challenging students. And a central question in the subjectification or the development of self-identity is, where do I stand? Because it's often only until we're confronted with something or challenged that we actually crystallize our particular point of view. And that's where we start to develop a sense of self-identity, but also perhaps it shifts with the challenges that we encounter. And Year 12 is a year for subjectification, that is the development of self-identity. It can be in a class talking about a particular text in English where a student is arguing a particular point of view and is challenged. It could be something about great expectations. It could be in history about the Weimar Republic, where they've got to be able to mount a coherent and sustained argument. And the way in which you do that is to talk, to interact beforehand, before committing words to paper or words to the screen. And across the Year 12, across all of the key learning areas, across all of their subjects, there are opportunities for students to engage with each other, to engage with the teacher. And that helps with the development of their self-identity. Now, some might argue that you can do that. You can interact across Zoom or Skype or Teams, etc. Well, yes, you can. But in my view, it's limited. It's limited because it's not a face-to-face situation where you get a complete picture of, say, what's called the paralinguistic features of the person you're interacting with, their gestures, their mannerisms, facial expressions, etc. The way in which to do it is face-to-face on site. And also, if you're in a Zoom meeting, a Zoom class, the class finishes, it's difficult to continue the conversation, whereas on site, students can continue the conversation into the next lesson or into lunchtime, out into the playground, etc. So in my view, it's very important that this transition into Year 12 for students is done face-to-face on site, but I would say provided that schools are safe places and that teachers, school staff and students are protected. Thank you very much. At this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Pearl Subin. Thanks, Pearl.
Thank you, Don. I'm also going to navigate sharing my screen. And I'm hoping that gets us to it. Thank you to the MCERA team, Shannon and Karen, for the opportunity to speak at this webinar. As a former teacher and now a researcher in the field, I'm hoping to reflect and consider with our Year 12 students as they commence their final year following significant online learning in 2021. It must be wonderful to be in Year 12. I can just remember what it was like. It's a very dim memory now because it's been many moons since I've been in Year 12. But I'm pretty sure that for most students, the shift must be quite tangible. You know, since the final year is often filled with color and badges being in Year 12, and if you're in a certain school, it might be a blazer. There's so much of these social elements that come with it. But then there's also multiple privileges and positions of status, especially when you're walking past those very new Year 7s who've just joined. However, the pressure of keeping up with the demands of multiple subjects, each with its competing workloads, can often take its toll. This can lead to psychological and social withdrawal as students begin to juggle these demands throughout the year. As a Year 12 student, you've probably heard your teachers talk about organization. In fact, your Year 12 coordinator might have mentioned it a couple of times. And the truth be told, they are right. Organization is central to success during this year, during this culminating year. But if you've heard it bandied around so much, what does organization actually mean to you as a Year 12 student? Most schools issue students with a physical diary to record dates and work requirements and so on. Students often use this valuable tool minimally. In fact, if you page through one of the diaries at the moment, there's not much recorded in there. Maybe we are looking at a contemporary generation that prefers an electronic version, such as Google Calendar, which many of us use at the moment. Why not opt for that instead? The school schedule may absorb many of the hours that you have with a timetable, and it's pretty prescribed by your school. But I think that the time that's allowed to you after school is something that you need to navigate and think about a little more clearly. I think you should be locking in some time as a Year 12 student to not just complete homework, but to also get in some much needed exam practice. If you lock in these times, it will become visible on your calendar, and then it becomes an explicit reminder of what you need to do. There's a great deal nowadays in the media, and even us as academics talk about this a lot, about automation. Remember, if you build in study routines which automatically fall into the same time around the same area every day, this will be really helpful because it will position you to achieve your goals and then reward you with the score that you deserve. Let's say if a major task is due in about 2 weeks, why not consider chunking it up into segments, allowing you to chip away at it slowly until you've completed it. This eases the pressure and prevents the late night scramble the day before it's due. For Year 12 students, procrastination can be a huge enemy, especially since so many things are due and require your attention all the time. So you need to stick to that schedule. This is going to require some discipline and self-regulation. And if I can borrow from one of the major sports manufacturers, just do it. Build in some relaxation time away from your desk. This is important. It's vital to recharge your batteries. We say this all the time, and get you feeling rested and refreshed. In line with this, avoid compromising sleep. This is essential to not only helping you to remember, but also clears your mind in readiness when you're learning. Reducing your sleeping hours is very unwise. Now, there will be some times when you start to feel a little overwhelmed and the anxiety might build up. in this regard, I would say seek help. There are many people who could help you see things from another perspective. Your family, your teachers, your friends. Sometimes just articulating the challenge, speaking it out, helps you to process it better. And if you're an introvert like me, among us, try writing. Writing is really therapeutic, and again, it might give you another perspective. But finally, after all the advice we've given you, remember, it's your year. You will make the most of what you want it to be. If your ATA is not what you expected at the end of this year, there's always plan B and C and D, no stress. I can get to London using just one stopover, or I can get to London via Tokyo. The important thing is I will get there eventually. Now, I'm just hoping that some of these moments of reflection with us together will equip you better, especially during this culminating year of your school life. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Rebecca, who's going to reflect on some of the homeschooling elements since we are now living with COVID as an endemic. So over to Rebecca. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Pearl, and everyone else who's spoken today. And I'm going to talk about a totally different type of transition. For some children during 2020 and 2021, they transitioned into the home. So I'm going to talk about those students who've decided not to transition back. So I think that this return to school year is going to be like no other, like we've said for the past 2 years in a row. But there are an increasing So there's an increasing number of families for whom staying at home is their preferred option. But before we start, I'd like to agree on some terms. And the first one is that what we did during the pandemic when children were sent home from school, it wasn't homeschooling and it wasn't home education. It was learning at home, and it had much more in common with distance education than with what actual homeschoolers do. Second, the preferred term is home education, not homeschooling, because home education in the community, that specific community, they see themselves quite oppositionally to schools, and they don't generally like to think of themselves in relation to school. They see what they do as providing an education, and schooling is one other option for providing that education. Third, the term home in home education doesn't describe where the bulk of their education happens. It describes the locus of control, so not the locus of education more broadly. And many home educators do the bulk of their educating outside of the home in the community. I think it's interesting and important to note that even before the pandemic, the numbers of home educators across the whole country had been growing. In 2011, I started doing this work. And at that time, there were about 9,000 legally registered home educators in Australia. But by 2021, last year, that number was around 26,000. And that's just the legal community. They're the people we know about. There are possibly that many again who don't register or who are unable to register because the child is under 6 or is over 17. There's also been an increase pretty evenly across all the states and territories, but the biggest growth has been seen in states like Queensland, where I am, where the numbers have grown from about 900 in 2011 to about 5,335 about October last year. So while I said that the trend was always up, the pandemic gave these figures a little nudge. Contrary to the popular image of parents really wanting to chuck their kids back to school as quickly as practical, although there were loads of families for whom that description was and remains apt, there's an entire meme library which you can look at later to support that idea. It seems that more and more parents are now considering home education. So informal and anecdotal data that I've been collecting from monitoring Facebook groups, as well as conversations with representatives of peak home education bodies like the Home Education Association, suggests there's been a weekly growth of between 500 and 600 parents interested or contacting support groups to find out about how they can go about home educating. I've described it in my work using the words of Karen Chegwidden from the Home Education Association as a risk-free trial that was offered by the pandemic, which revealed some fissures and tensions between parents and schools. And for those parents who found those fissures, home education might be a way to solve that. I think to departments are going to struggle, and they're going to have to respond to this uptick with practical and sensible strategies. However, it does seem that they are already struggling. The time for registration, for example, from application to approval has now more than doubled from 6 weeks to more than 12 weeks, and that's just in New South Wales and Queensland. In many cases, it blows out past that and be maybe around 20 weeks. Some ways that my research suggests we can respond to this growth is to increase staff who can manage registration in state education departments and territory education departments. We could look at changing the restrictions and reporting requirements, maybe paring them right back and looking at what, good practice happens in other states. There could be an opportunity to offer part-time school as an option, and they do that in Victoria quite formally, but even informally, I'm sure we've all heard of parents who have kids who attend school some of the time, not all of the time, even if that's kept quite quiet and is really on the down low. I think public servants and people who work in policy and practice in the home education units across the various states and territories should be looking at a bit more training and understanding of home education and its differences from school. At the moment, most of those people are ex-teachers or education officers who've had some experience in a classroom. Possibly a panel type structure where practiced and experienced home educators assist governments in the registration process could save a lot of time and money, because they could vet the majority of registration and reporting responses before sending a few up the chain to be sort of checked by policy specialists to ensure what is being accepted is in line with the state or territory's Education Act. And finally, maybe we need to look again at our Education Act across the whole country to take account of the differences between parents who are always parents even when they're home educating, they are never teachers, and between home and school education to provide flexibility in mode and approach. And I think that's really what parents are looking for. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much to all of our panellists for your presentations there. Rebecca, I have really enjoyed this extra time that I've had with my Year 3 and my Year 6 over the last couple of years. But while you were doing that presentation, I also had my Year 3 dragging my Year 6 on a chair in the background. So if I looked a bit distracted, I'm very much looking forward to their return to school and trying to balance out.
Shannon, maybe you need to go and just calm yourself with some of those memes that are available.
Yeah, potentially. But thank you all. Like I said to other attendees, if you would like to ask questions, we've now got an opportunity to speak to our panellists about their research. But I wanted to start with a question around exhaustion and burnout for people sort of on the whole, and how we help kids with that transition. We all talk about how we are all exhausted as adults for having managed our emotions and the experiences of the pandemic. And we know that socialisation is so important, but we also know that there are a lot of kids who are experiencing social anxiety after the last 2 years and after perhaps extended periods of time of being outside of the regular social structures. What are some of those things that we can help to ensure that our Year 12s or even our younger kids aren't being negatively impacted by that burnout that we are as a collective society feeling at the moment, 2 years into the pandemic? I'm going to jump straight to Kathleen, who talked about ways that we can support kids, and then maybe Kathleen, you want to hand over to Don?
Sure. I think keeping communication open is important. Children are very, as adults are, very clever at being able to mask their situation. They'll I'm fine, I'm okay, and then go into their room and scream into their pillow. Or maybe they're not even aware of how stressed they are. We're becoming masters of uploading our stress, aren't we? We take on more stress. So I think, trying to have that conversation, asking students how they're going, and maybe planning for, something. You've got till the end of the day, and then when I pick you up, we're going to go and do, A, B, or C, whatever the child likes to do. Might be a run in the park with the dog. Might be a play with a child, a play day. Might be just sitting down at home and watching the afternoon show that they particularly like with a cookie. Maybe it's cooking something with mum or dad. whatever it is that the individual likes, and planning, having a look at, so I think it was Pearl that was talking about having a a diary. So let's have a look at what's coming up. What do we need to do to get prepared for that? So having an action plan. I like being proactive. We're all in situations where we need to be, retrofitting, but if we can think, okay, what's coming up? How do you feel about that? What do we need to get ready for that? What have the other kids got? So it might be, a special calculator, or it might be a particular something or other. And, just seeing whether we can help the student transition into whatever an area of distress might be for them.
If I could jump in there. Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. I certainly agree with all you said, and you mentioned parents, and I think one of the positive things about the lockdowns, I think, has been parents' engagement with their child's learning, and possibly engagement with the curriculum at a more intimate level than previously. So that many parents, and look, I don't have hard data on this, but many parents, I'm sure, have a better handle on curriculum, syllabuses, and what's required. And I think teachers, the standing of teachers in the community as a result of that re-energised parental involvement, even though it's been really hard, the standing of teachers has increased. So one thing I would suggest is that schools, and they do this well, keeping close contact with parents. I've heard the term used, re-entry anxiety, for people. For us, we've been in lockdown and we've got to go back and mix with others. And I think that's a pretty good term. So I would think that schools would let parents know if they felt that students were experiencing that type of anxiety. But I also think that as students are progressing through the years, particularly with Year 12, the relationship with teachers is much more relaxed, much more comfortable, much more at an adult level. And those Year 12 teachers are in a really good position to know their students and to know when someone is not faring well. And I would expect that, and I'm sure that would happen, and schools are good at this, those teachers would be having conversations with their students, asking them, are you okay? What's been happening? In Year 12 in particular, the stakes are high. And in my experience as a teacher, head of teacher, inspector of English, etc., teachers do that really well. The local level, the teacher with the student, with the parents.
I agree with Don. There's different levels of anxiety. There's different kinds of anxiety. And for students, it can be just anticipatory anxiety. They're anticipating that the situation is going to be scary. It's going to be scary, so they build that up in their heads. And also there's school-based anxiety, the fact that they don't want to fail. They don't want to get a negative result on an assessment. School equals assessment. So, they don't want to come home with a bad report, or just a report that their parents are not going to consider as being, a good report. So I totally agree with Don. It's that looking at, how you can unpack the student's distress. And we keep talking about, parents and children, but I also would like to put the spotlight on teachers. Teachers don't know it all either. There's a reason why we have a lack of people in classrooms at the moment. And so I think we also need to think about, upskilling teachers in certain areas. When you've got students with different needs, in my area of, I don't like to say expertise, my areas of focus and interest is special education, or students with special learning needs. Now, you look at an assignment that a teacher puts to a class, there may be students with particular learning needs who need an adjustment, a different way of submitting their assignment. And there are numerous reasonable adjustments that can be evidenced with a particular piece of assessment. So rather than writing an essay, maybe presenting a presentation. But teachers need to learn how to do that. That's not, they need to have those skills. And we're all academics. I'm sure we would love to have more teacher education happening to assist students with, adjusting and having those reasonable adjustments to to their teaching strategies and to the various forms of assessment.
Thanks, Kathleen. That actually raises a question for you, Rebecca, around whether there are particular groups of students that we are seeing moving more into the home education space than others. And it occurred to me when you were first talking, Kathleen, that schools aren't necessarily set up for all students in their current format. Are there particular groups that we're seeing moving more into that home education space than other groups?
Yeah, Shannon, it's really interesting. We see lots of students with special education needs, the ones that Kathleen is really interested in her work, who tend to be more attracted to home education. So part of the research I was in with the Autism CRC in the last couple of years has looked at kids on the spectrum, ASD kids, who around grade 4 tend to find that the social engagements of school, coupled with the academic sort of emphasis that changes around that point, tends to lead them to not want to go and to be school refusers. So we've been looking at those sort of families. We find that there's a lot of kids on the spectrum, children who are often labelled ADHD, anyone who's not neurotypical can find school quite confronting, and they're the families that tend to be more drawn to home education. But the thing I think that's interesting about home ed, it's not a once and for all choice. For a lot of families, it's a transitory choice that they make, and then the child goes back to school. So I think the research says something like 80% of them do home ed just for a short amount of time, and then they go back to school, often in senior, so maybe grade 7, grade 10, 11, where they are, needing to get an ATAR or want to go to university.
Thank you. And Pearl, drawing on your presentation around how Year 12s can be, or senior students can be prepared for those years, for those students who perhaps have transitioned out for a while because traditional school doesn't necessarily suit them, maybe they are neurodivergent, what are the sort of particular aspects of your recommendations around supporting students in those senior years that might be particularly relevant to that group?
Thanks, Shannon. I think that there would be a number of students, it's like Kathleen says, there's a number of students with additional learning needs who might transition into home education, like Rebecca pointed out, home education it is. When we're thinking about that though, I think maintaining a routine during home education would probably be absolutely valuable. It's similar to working in a classroom, I would think, because you'd still need to be regulating your time and managing your time appropriately so that you cover the requirements of the curriculum. I think that students in the senior years who are learning at home would probably still be restricted to the same learning outcomes that the students at school operate by. So there will be a need for them to be embracing the same learning outcomes, and in so doing, they probably need to still have a schedule of activities that need to be completed. The benefit of doing it from home, I suppose, would be the fact that that your pace is not dictated to by a teacher or the other students in the classroom. There's going to be some freedom and flexibility by working from home. So there's going to be some joy out of that, I suppose. I remember earlier writing an article about introverts, just loving it during the lockdown. Introverts loving the lockdown, and it was interesting to see how many school students contacted us then to say that they just loved the idea of not having the schedule. It was a lot more relaxed and they could fulfill tasks as they chose and when they chose, rather than being strictly determined by the school bell in a way. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. I've just had a message come through on direct message, particularly for Don, but others might wish to comment on this. What do you think, Don, will be the impact on students with the lack of socialisation that they have had through their education in the last couple of years?
I mean, it's a very good question, and I guess it remains to be seen. If this re-entry anxiety is probably very real, and for some students, it's going to take them a while to feel comfortable again, and perhaps even comfortable with their teachers, comfortable in the new sort of, or getting back to that routine of school-based learning. And I guess that's where parents can help out. That relationship between the school and the parents is very important to get students through that period, that transition period. but also, as I said before, I think schools are very good at identifying students who are struggling. And in our schools, all the time there've been, students struggling with different sorts of issues. This is a unique issue because we've just come out of this unique period. Hopefully we're out of it. And I'm sure schools will be able to help students through this. Academically, it remains to be seen, though there was a report a few months ago that the NAPLAN results don't seem to have suffered greatly, I think from memory, is what I saw.
Thank you. Does anyone have anything else they'd like to add on that point? Okay, well, we're conscious of the time and I'm conscious that we've gone a smidgen over. I'd like to thank all of our presenters once again for your efforts today, for coming along, for putting together your speeches and presentations that you had for us. Thank you too for our visitors who came along and took part in this, and I wish you all the best for 2022. Let's hope that we are out the other side of all of this. Thanks.